Jack had always thought of his garage as a sacred space. It wasn't just a place to park his car, it was his fortress of solitude. A cluttered haven where tools were scattered like breadcrumbs leading to half-finished projects, and where the smell of motor oil mingled with the faint aroma of old coffee cups he'd forgotten to throw away. But one fateful Tuesday morning, Jack's sanctuary was invaded. And not by raccoons or nosy neighbors. No, this was far worse. It was Karen. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, had parked her beat-up sedan smack in the middle of Jack's garage. Not near it. Not next to it. In it. And for reasons Jack couldn't fathom, she seemed to think this was perfectly acceptable behavior. Now, if you've never dealt with an HOA before, let me enlighten you, they are less a governing body and more a cult of clipboard-wielding tyrants who thrive on enforcing rules nobody asked for. Karen was their fearless leader, a woman who could spot an unapproved mailbox from 3 blocks away and issue a fine before you even had time to say paint swatches. She was the kind of person who made you wonder if she'd been born with a whistle in her mouth and a laminated copy of the neighborhood bylaws clutched in her tiny baby hands. Jack stood there, staring at the car as though it might suddenly sprout legs and walk itself out. It didn't. Instead, Karen emerged from the passenger side door, clutching a Starbucks cup like it was an Olympic torch. "Oh, hey Jack," she said casually, as though she hadn't just commandeered his private property like a pirate claiming treasure. "I needed somewhere to park while my driveway's being repaved." Jack blinked. "Karen, this is my garage." "I know," she replied brightly, as if Jack had just pointed out that water is wet. "But your garage has been empty for weeks now. I figured you weren't using it." Jack's jaw dropped so hard he worried it might dislocate. "That doesn't mean you can just park here." Karen took a sip of her coffee and gave him a look that suggested she'd already won this argument in her head. "Actually, according to HOA regulations, and used spaces can be reassigned for community needs." Jack felt his blood pressure spike so high he briefly considered calling an ambulance. "Community needs? Karen, this is my property." Karen waved dismissively as though Jack's indignation were merely an annoying fly buzzing around her perfectly coiffed head. "Oh, don't be dramatic, Jack. It's not like I'm living here." Jack wanted to scream. He wanted to grab his leaf blower and chase Karen down the street like some sort of suburban vigilante. But instead, he did what any reasonable adult would do. He called his lawyer. Unfortunately for Jack, his lawyer, a man named Ted who specialized in real estate disputes, was less than optimistic about his chances of evicting Karen's car. "Well," Ted said after reviewing the HOA bylaws with the kind of grim expression usually reserved for funeral directors delivering bad news, "technically speaking, she's not wrong." Jack nearly dropped his phone. "What do you mean she's not wrong?" Ted sighed heavily as though explaining basic math to someone who'd just failed algebra 3 times in a row. "The HOA has clauses about underutilized spaces being reassigned for communal use if deemed necessary by the board." "But it's my garage," Jack protested. "Yes," Ted agreed solemnly, "but according to these bylaws, your ownership rights are subject to HOA oversight." Jack hung up feeling defeated and slightly homicidal. For days afterward, Karen treated Jack's garage like her personal parking lot. She came and went as she pleased, sometimes leaving her car there overnight without so much as a courtesy text. Jack tried reasoning with her again but was met with the same infuriating smile and condescending tone. "Jack," she said one afternoon as she unloaded groceries from her trunk in his garage, "you really need to learn how to share." It was at that moment Jack realized 2 things. 1, Karen was never going to move her car willingly, and 2, he needed revenge. But not just any revenge, petty revenge. The kind that would make Karen regret every smug comment she'd ever made about lawn heights or trash can placement. Jack began researching local laws about abandoned vehicles on private property. He learned that if a car remained on someone's land without permission for more than 72 hours and wasn't claimed after proper notification, it could legally be considered abandoned and removed at the owner's expense. Armed with this knowledge and fueled by righteous anger, Jack drafted an official notice and taped it to Karen's windshield while she was out running errands. When Karen returned later that evening and saw the notice, she laughed, a loud, obnoxious laugh that echoed through the neighborhood like nails on a chalkboard. "Oh please," she said when Jack confronted her again. "You're not seriously going to tow my car?" Jack didn't respond. He simply smiled, a smile so unsettling it made Karen pause for half a second before brushing past him into her house. The next morning at exactly 9 a.m., 72 hours after posting the notice, Jack called a local scrap yard and arranged for Karen's car to be picked up. As the tow truck arrived and began hooking up Karen's beloved sedan, Jack felt an overwhelming sense of satisfaction wash over him like warm sunshine after days of rain. Karen stormed out of her house just in time to see her car being hauled away. "What are you doing?" she shrieked. "Removing abandoned property," Jack replied calmly. "You can't do this." Karen screamed. "Oh," Jack said with mock innocence, "but according to HOA regulations." Karen sputtered incoherently as the tow truck drove off into the distance. For once in his life, Jack felt truly victorious, not because he'd won some legal battle or proven himself smarter than Karen, but because he'd finally reclaimed his garage and his dignity. And as he stood there watching Karen stomp back into her house muttering threats under her breath, Jack couldn't help but laugh, a deep-bellied laugh that echoed through the neighborhood like sweet revenge itself. Jack was not a man who gave up easily, but after his initial confrontation with Karen and the crushing realization that the HOA bylaws were written in a language only slightly less convoluted than ancient hieroglyphs, he found himself in uncharted waters. It wasn't just that Karen had parked her car in his garage, it was the principle of the thing. This wasn't about a parking dispute. This was about justice. And also, Jack really hated Karen. The next morning, Jack decided to take the diplomatic route. He marched over to Karen's house, clipboard in hand, ready to reason with her like two civilized adults. Unfortunately, reasoning with Karen was like trying to teach a cat to do taxes, pointless and infuriating. Karen opened the door with her usual air of superiority, holding a cup of herbal tea as though she were auditioning for a commercial about inner peace. "Jack," she said with a smile so fake it could have been trademarked, "what brings you by?" Jack took a deep breath. "Karen, we need to talk about your car." Karen's smile didn't waver. "Oh, is it still in your garage? I thought you'd be happy to contribute to the community by letting me use the space." "Happy?" Jack's voice cracked slightly. "Karen, it's my garage. My property. You can't just..." Karen raised a perfectly manicured hand to cut him off. "Actually, Jack, according to Section 14B of the HOA bylaws, unused spaces can be requisitioned for community purposes if deemed necessary by the board." Jack blinked at her. "Community purposes? It's your car, Karen." "Well," she said with a shrug, "I am part of the community." Jack felt his blood pressure rise to dangerous levels. "Karen, this isn't how property works." Karen took a sip of her tea and gave him a pitying look. "Oh, Jack, you really should read the bylaws more carefully." Jack stormed back home, muttering curses under his breath and vowing to never trust anyone who drank chamomile tea again. He spent the rest of the day poring over the HOA documents, which were roughly as comprehensible as quantum physics written in crayon. Every time he thought he'd found a loophole that might help him reclaim his garage, he'd hit another wall of legal jargon so dense it could have been used as armor plating. By evening, Jack was ready to admit defeat until his neighbor Steve dropped by. Steve was one of those guys who seemed to know everything about everything. He was also perpetually embroiled in some kind of feud with the HOA, which made him something of an expert on their ridiculous rules. "Karen parked in your garage?" Steve asked when Jack explained the situation. "That's bold even for her." "She says it's allowed under Section 14B, Jack grumbled. Steve snorted. "Section 14B? That clause is older than my grandmother's dentures. It hasn't been enforced since the 90s. Then why is she getting away with it?" Jack demanded. "Because she's Karen," Steve said simply. "She knows nobody wants to deal with the hassle of fighting her." Jack stared at him for a moment before slamming his fist on the table. "Well, I'm not nobody. I'm fighting this." Steve grinned and clapped him on the shoulder. "That's the spirit. Just make sure you document everything." And so began Jack's descent into what he would later refer to as the Great Garage War. Armed with his phone camera and a notebook labeled Evidence, he started keeping meticulous records of every time Karen entered or exited his garage. He even installed a motion-activated camera above the door to catch her in the act. But Karen wasn't just bold. She was clever. When she realized Jack was watching her every move, she started parking her car in his garage only during odd hours when she thought he wouldn't notice. She even went so far as to leave passive-aggressive notes on his windshield whenever he parked in his own driveway. One particularly memorable note read, "Jack, your driveway is an eyesore. Consider landscaping." Jack had never wanted to set fire to something so badly in his life. Things escalated further when Karen called an emergency HOA meeting to address what she called Jack's uncooperative behavior. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse. a beige monstrosity that smelled faintly of mildew and broken dreams, and attended by every busybody within a 5-mile radius. Karen stood at the front of the room like some kind of suburban dictator, clutching a stack of papers and wearing an expression that suggested she was about to declare martial law. "Neighbors?" she began in a tone that oozed condescension. "I've called this meeting because one of our residents has been flagrantly disregarding HOA guidelines." Jack sat in the back row, arms crossed and teeth clenched so tightly he worried they might shatter. "This resident," Karen continued dramatically, "has refused to cooperate with reasonable requests for space sharing and has resorted to harassment tactics such as surveillance cameras and inflammatory language." Jack shot out of his seat before she could finish. "Inflammatory language? Karen, you left me notes calling my driveway an eyesore." Karen gasped as though he'd just insulted her ancestors. "I was offering constructive criticism." The room erupted into murmurs as other residents began whispering about their own grievances with Karen. Her tendency to nitpick lawn heights, her habit of monopolizing guest parking spaces during her book club meetings, which nobody had ever been invited to, and her infamous feud with Mrs. Jenkins over holiday decorations. Sensing that she was losing control of the narrative, Karen tried redirecting attention back to Jack. "The point is," she said loudly, "we all need to work together for the good of our community. That's rich coming from someone who parks in other people's garages." Steve muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. The meeting dissolved into chaos after that, with half the room siding with Jack and the other half too afraid of Karen's wrath to speak up. By the end of it, nothing had been resolved except that Jack now hated HOAs even more than he hated kale smoothies, which was saying something. As he walked home that night under the dim glow of streetlights, Jack realized two things. One, fighting Karen through official channels was going to be an uphill battle. And two, he needed a new plan. A plan that would hit Karen where it hurt most. Not just her ego but her sense of untouchable authority. And if there was one thing Jack knew how to do well, it was being petty. Jack had always considered himself a patient man. He was the type of guy who could sit through a 3-hour DMV line without losing his cool, who didn't honk at people when they took too long at a green light, and who even tolerated his mother-in-law's unsolicited advice about his unfashionable haircut. But Karen was testing the limits of his humanity. After the HOA meeting debacle, Jack realized that trying to reason with Karen or appeal to the HOA board was about as effective as yelling at a cloud. If he wanted his garage back, he'd have to take matters into his own hands. And by take matters into his own hands, Jack meant he was about to embark on an elaborate revenge plan that would make even the pettiest of suburban warriors proud. The first step in Jack's master plan was research. He spent hours combing through legal websites, HOA forums, and even YouTube videos titled things like, "How to Deal with HOA Bullies Without Losing Your Mind." It was during one of these late-night rabbit holes that Jack stumbled upon a golden nugget of information. Local laws regarding abandoned property. According to city regulations, any vehicle left on private property for more than 72 hours without permission could be classified as abandoned. Once classified as abandoned, the property owner had the right to have it removed. Jack's eyes lit up as he read this. Karen's car wasn't just an annoyance. It was now a legal liability. But Jack wasn't stupid. He knew Karen would fight him tooth and nail if he tried to tow her car without warning. So he decided to play by the rules, well, sort of. He drafted an official-looking notice using a template he found online and taped it to Karen's windshield. The notice read, "This vehicle has been left on private property without permission and is subject to removal under City Code Section 12-345. If not removed within 72 hours, the vehicle will be towed at the owner's expense." Jack stood back and admired his handiwork. The paper looked so official that even he almost believed it had been issued by some government agency. Satisfied, he went back inside and waited. Karen didn't respond immediately, which Jack found both surprising and deeply satisfying. For once, she wasn't barging into his yard with her clipboard or leaving passive-aggressive notes on his door. Maybe she'd finally realized she was in the wrong. But no, this was Karen. On the second day after Jack posted the notice, Karen showed up at his front door with her usual air of smug entitlement. She held the notice in one hand like it was evidence in a courtroom drama and pointed at it accusingly. "Jack," she began in that condescending tone that made him want to scream into a pillow. "What is this nonsense?" Jack leaned casually against the doorframe and crossed his arms. "It's not nonsense, Karen. It's a legal notice." Karen scoffed so loudly it startled a bird off a nearby tree branch. "Legal? Please, you can't just make up rules because you're upset." "I didn't make anything up," Jack said calmly, though inside he was imagining himself flipping her tea table over in slow motion. "It's city law." Karen rolled her eyes so hard Jack worried they might get stuck that way. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. My car isn't abandoned. It's parked." "In my garage," Jack shot back. Karen waved her hand dismissively, as though this minor detail were irrelevant. "It's temporary. It's been 2 weeks. Temporary is subjective." Jack stared at her for a long moment, wondering if she genuinely believed her own nonsense or if she just enjoyed gaslighting people for sport. "Well," Jack said finally, "you've got until tomorrow to move it." Karen narrowed her eyes at him like a cat sizing up its prey. "Or what?" Jack smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that made Karen take half a step back before catching herself. "Or I'll have it towed." Karen laughed. A sharp, humorless laugh that echoed down the street like nails on a chalkboard. "You wouldn't dare." Jack didn't respond. He just kept smiling until Karen turned on her heel and stormed off. The next morning, exactly 72 hours after posting the notice, Jack made good on his promise. He called a local towing company and explained the situation in painstaking detail, making sure they understood that this wasn't just some petty neighbor dispute, even though it absolutely was. The tow truck arrived within an hour, its engine rumbling like sweet music to Jack's ears. As the driver hooked up Karen's car to the tow truck, Jack couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph coursing through his veins. This wasn't just about reclaiming his garage. It was about standing up for himself against years of HOA tyranny and Karen's insufferable smugness. Of course, Karen chose that exact moment to come outside. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, running toward the tow truck like it was kidnapping her firstborn child. "Removing abandoned property," Jack said matter-of-factly. "That's my car," Karen yelled. "Not anymore," Jack replied with mock innocence. "According to city law, I don't care about your stupid laws," Karen interrupted, her face turning an alarming shade of red. The tow truck driver glanced between them awkwardly before shrugging and continuing his work. He'd clearly seen this kind of drama before and wasn't about to get involved. "You can't do this," Karen screamed as the tow truck began pulling away with her car in tow. "Oh," Jack said with a grin so wide it hurt his cheeks, "but I can." Karen stood there sputtering incoherently as the tow truck disappeared down the street, leaving behind nothing but tire marks and an eerie silence. For once in her life, Karen had nothing to say, and for Jack, that silence was worth more than all the garages in the world combined. Karen stood in Jack's driveway, her face frozen in an expression that was equal parts rage and disbelief. Her car, her precious, rule-breaking car, was gone, towed away like a rogue shopping cart at a Walmart parking lot. Jack, meanwhile, stood on his porch sipping coffee from a mug that read "World's Okayest Neighbor," watching the scene unfold with the kind of satisfaction usually reserved for lottery winners and people who successfully parallel park on the first try. "You're going to regret this, Jack," Karen finally shrieked, her voice cracking like a cheap porcelain plate. Jack raised an eyebrow and took another leisurely sip of his coffee. "Oh, I don't think I will," he replied with a grin so smug it could have been framed and hung in a museum of petty victories. Karen stormed off, muttering something about lawsuits and calling the authorities. Jack wasn't worried. He'd done his homework, followed the law to the letter, and even double-checked the city's regulations just to be sure. If Karen wanted to escalate things, she'd find herself wading into a bureaucratic swamp, a place where Jack had already set up camp with snacks and a lawn chair. But Karen wasn't the type to go quietly into that good night. No, Karen was more of a burn the whole neighborhood down if I don't get my way kind of person. And true to form, she wasted no time launching her counterattack. The next day, Jack received a letter from the HOA, a thick envelope stuffed with official-looking documents that practically screamed Karen wrote this while furiously sipping chamomile tea. The letter accused Jack of violating multiple HOA regulations, including unauthorized removal of community property, Karen's car, failure to maintain harmonious neighbor relations, Karen's feelings, and general hostility toward HOA leadership, Karen herself. Jack read the letter twice, then laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. Harmonious neighbor relations? He muttered to himself. That ship sailed the second she parked in my garage. Still, Jack knew better than to ignore HOA correspondence. He drafted a polite but firm response, attaching copies of the city's abandoned vehicle laws and pointing out that Karen's car had been on his property without permission. He even included timestamps from his security camera footage as evidence. It was the legal equivalent of saying, checkmate. A week later, Jack received another letter from the HOA, this one shorter but no less ridiculous. It informed him that his actions were under review by the HOA board and that he was required to attend a special hearing to resolve this matter amicably. The hearing was scheduled for Saturday morning at 9 a.m., which Jack suspected was Karen's passive-aggressive way of ruining his weekend. When Saturday rolled around, Jack arrived at the community clubhouse armed with a folder full of evidence and enough caffeine in his system to power a small city. The room was already packed with HOA members, most of whom looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Karen sat at the front of the room like some kind of suburban monarch, her clipboard resting on her lap like a scepter. Thank you all for coming, Karen began in her best imitation of someone who wasn't plotting revenge. We're here today to address an egregious violation of HOA policies by one of our residents. Jack leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, ready for whatever nonsense she was about to spew. Mr. Jack, Karen continued, emphasizing his name as though it were synonymous with villain, has taken it upon himself to tow my vehicle, a vehicle that was parked in accordance with Section 14B of our bylaws. Jack raised his hand. Point of clarification, Section 14B doesn't apply here because it refers to communal spaces, not private property. Karen's smile faltered for half a second before she recovered. Regardless, she said through gritted teeth, his actions were extreme and unnecessary. Unnecessary? Jack repeated incredulously. Karen, you parked in my garage without asking. What did you expect me to do, build you a welcome sign? A few people in the audience chuckled quietly before Karen shot them a glare so icy it could have frozen lava. This isn't about me, Karen said dramatically, placing a hand on her chest as though she were some kind of martyr for neighborhood justice. This is about maintaining order and ensuring everyone abides by our community standards. Jack couldn't help himself, he laughed out loud. Order? Standards? Karen, you've been breaking your own rules since day one. Remember when you fined Steve for having an unapproved mailbox while your lawn gnome collection violated at least 3 aesthetic guidelines? Steve nodded vigorously from the back row. Yeah. And don't forget how she blocked guest parking for her book club meetings. Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red as more residents began chiming in with their grievances, everything from her micromanaging tendencies to her habit of issuing fines over trivial matters like slightly uneven hedges. Realizing she was losing control of the room, Karen banged her clipboard on the table like a gavel. Enough, she snapped. This meeting is about Jack's behavior, not mine. Funny, Jack said dryly. Because it seems like everyone here has something to say about yours. The room erupted into murmurs again as people exchanged knowing looks and whispered complaints about Karen's reign of terror. For once, Jack felt like he wasn't alone in his battle against HOA tyranny. Sensing that her authority was slipping away faster than an ice cube on hot asphalt, Karen tried one last desperate tactic, playing the victim card. I've always done what I thought was best for this community, she said tearfully, though no actual tears appeared. And now I'm being attacked for trying to uphold our values. Jack rolled his eyes so hard he worried they might get stuck that way. Karen, he said bluntly, this isn't about values, it's about your ego. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at Karen, who suddenly seemed much smaller than usual. After what felt like an eternity, one of the board members cleared their throat awkwardly and addressed Jack directly. Mr. Jack, they said hesitantly, while we understand your frustration, perhaps there's a way we can resolve this without further conflict? Jack sighed deeply but nodded. He didn't want things to drag on any longer than they already had. In the end, it was decided that Karen would issue a formal apology, which she clearly hated, and reimburse Jack for any towing fees incurred during the Great Garage War. Additionally, and perhaps most importantly, the HOA agreed to revise their bylaws to prevent similar incidents from happening in the future. As Jack left the clubhouse that day with his head held high and his garage officially reclaimed, he couldn't help but feel victorious, not just for himself but for every resident who'd ever suffered under Karen's iron-fisted rule. Sometimes justice wasn't just served, it was parked right where it belonged, in your own damn garage. Jack had won. The garage was his again. Karen had been forced to apologize, albeit through gritted teeth, and the HOA bylaws were being revised to prevent future acts of vehicular piracy. By all accounts, this should have been the end of the saga, a triumphant conclusion to Jack's battle against suburban tyranny. But if you've ever dealt with someone like Karen, you know that people like her don't go down without a fight. Or, in this case, without one last act of petty vengeance. The morning after the HOA hearing, Jack woke up feeling lighter than he had in weeks. He brewed himself a cup of coffee, stepped out onto his porch to enjoy the crisp morning air, and basked in the sweet, sweet glow of victory. For the first time in ages, he didn't have to worry about Karen's car squatting in his garage or her clipboard-wielding antics disrupting his life. But as he sipped his coffee and gazed out at his driveway, something caught his eye as something that made him nearly choke on his drink. There, sitting smack in the middle of his front lawn, was a giant inflatable flamingo. Not just any flamingo, mind you. This one was wearing sunglasses and holding a margarita glass the size of a small child. Jack stared at it for a long moment, trying to process what he was seeing. Was this some kind of prank? A bizarre Amazon delivery gone wrong? And then it hit him, Karen. Of course it was Karen. Jack marched over to the flamingo and found a note taped to its oversized beak. In Karen's unmistakable handwriting, it read, "Since you're so concerned about property rights, I figured I'd give you something to decorate your lawn with. You're welcome." Jack crumpled the note in his hand and let out a long sigh. He should have known Karen wouldn't let things go quietly. This was her way of getting back at him, passive-aggressive lawn art warfare. But Jack wasn't about to let her win. Oh no, if Karen wanted a battle of pettiness, she'd picked the wrong opponent. The first thing Jack did was move the flamingo, not off his lawn, but closer to Karen's property line. He positioned it so that its oversized margarita glass was pointed directly at her living room window, as if mocking her from across the yard. Then he added a sign beneath it that read, "Courtesy of Karen, HOA's official flamingo ambassador." By noon, neighbors were stopping by to take pictures with the flamingo and laughing at Jack's sign. Even Steve came over with a beer in hand and declared it the best thing to happen in this neighborhood since they repaved the sidewalks. Karen, however, was less amused. The next morning, Jack woke up to find that Karen had retaliated by planting a row of plastic garden gnomes along her side of the property line. Each gnome was holding a tiny picket sign with messages like, "Respect HOA rules," and "No flamingos allowed." Jack couldn't help but laugh as he stared at the gnome army standing guard on Karen's lawn. It was so absurdly over the top that he almost admired her commitment to being insufferable. Almost. Not one to back down from a challenge, Jack decided to escalate things further. He went online and ordered an inflatable T-Rex, because if Karen thought she could intimidate him with gnomes, she clearly hadn't considered the raw power of prehistoric reptiles. When the T-Rex arrived 2 days later, Jack wasted no time setting it up next to the flamingo. He even dressed it in a Hawaiian shirt and gave it a foam finger that said #OneNeighbor, just for good measure. The neighborhood quickly descended into chaos as more residents joined in on the fun. Steve put up a banner on his porch that read, "Team Flamingo," while Mrs. Jenkins across the street countered with her own sign declaring allegiance to Team Gnome. Someone else added an inflatable unicorn to their yard, just because. And before long, what had started as a petty feud between Jack and Karen had turned into an all-out suburban arms race of ridiculous lawn decorations. Karen tried to regain control by calling another emergency HOA meeting, but by this point, nobody was taking her seriously anymore. Even her staunchest supporters were too busy debating whether Steve's inflatable pirate ship violated height restrictions or if Mrs. Jenkins' LED-lit garden fairy display counted as excessive illumination. Defeated but not deterred, Karen retreated into her house and sulked behind closed blinds while Jack basked in his newfound status as the neighborhood hero. And yet, despite all the chaos and absurdity that had unfolded over the past few weeks, Jack couldn't help but feel content. Sure, his front yard now looked like the set of an off-brand carnival parade, but for once in his life, he felt like he'd truly stood up for himself, and maybe even brought his neighbors closer together in the process. As he sat on his porch one evening watching Steve attempt and fail to inflate a 12-foot-tall octopus for reasons nobody fully understood, Jack realized something important. Sometimes revenge isn't just about getting even. It's about creating something so ridiculous and memorable that nobody ever dares mess with you again. And if that meant sharing his lawn with an inflatable flamingo and a Hawaiian shirt-wearing T-Rex for a little while longer, well, so be it. So here's to Jack, the man who took on Karen and won not just his garage back but also the respect and laughter of an entire neighborhood. If you enjoyed this tale of suburban warfare and petty triumphs, or if you've ever dealt with your own version of Karen, don't forget to like this story. Share it with your friends who need a good laugh or some inspiration for their next HOA showdown. And hey, drop a comment below about your favorite part or your own revenge story. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of hilarity and justice served cold.